Hey everyone, welcome to the September 21st edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragonin. I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to be taking a look back at last weeks of racing around the country, focusing primarily on Woodbine, Belmont Park, and Churchill Downs. They had some interesting stakes at all of those venues. Some grade ones run up in Canada at Woodbine, including their banner day where they run the Woodbine Mile and the Canadian International. Also a couple of two-year-old grade ones, which will serve as preps for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf and Juvenile Turf. At Belmont, they had that new series, the Jockey Club races on Saturday, the Oaks and the Derby. Also some turf stakes earlier in the week, one of which we're going to talk about. And at Churchill Downs, which we previewed on the forecast last week, they had a really nice night of racing where they ran the Pocahontas and the Iroquois for the two-year-olds, the Locust Grove for the older horses. Last year's Kentucky Oaks winner, She Dares the Devil, was the protagonist in there. Also some stakes for the sprinters and an impressive two-year-old debut winner that we're going to talk about towards the end of the podcast, along with one more from a different venue, which we'll get to at the very end of the show. But Craig, some interesting performances all around the country. Turf, though, was really the focus at both Woodbine and Belmont.
Yeah, a lot of big races. I think all of the group ones or grade ones were at those two venues. So I think we saw some really good performances. I guess we're going to start with the grade one Woodbine Mile, which had a lot of talking points in its own right. And it was won on the front end by Town Cruise. He was a horse that we didn't review these races, but he looked really good on our TimeformUS Pace Projector. And I'll be honest, I was a little iffy on him, given how he had a similar, pretty easy lead last time and gave it up in the Grade 2 King Edward. But in this day, for the better purse and a better grade, he was able to just keep on going on the front end. Wound up with a career best. I believe it was 126 TimeformUS speed figure. And like I said, because of that pace projector, I actually really did like him in this spot. And I think it's something we really need to talk about. He was 23-1 with maybe a minute to post. And I say maybe because they dragged the post for a very long time. It had shown 0. But as they were walking into the lawn, he was 22-1, something like that. And I thought I was getting the bargain of the century on this guy. And then the race goes off and he makes an easy lead. So I was getting a little bit excited. But for whatever reason, I think there's been a press release saying they had some kind of difficulties. No odds were shown during the race. So I was quite surprised when he cruised home fairly easily, never really looked in jeopardy down through the lane. And he wound up 8-1. So I got to tell you, horse racing is the only sport where you can win and still be justifiably a little annoyed.
Yeah, I saw some people posting about that on Twitter, and that is frustrating if you back that horse. It's, in racing, there very seldom is just something too good to be true. And with a horse like this going into the gate at 23-1, that probably was one of those scenarios where it just was too good to be true. Because as you said, this is a horse that had speed figures, and the TimeformUS Pace Projector was all over this horse, showing it as a situation favors on or near the lead, with him clearly up on the lead by himself. And that's the way the race played out, and he was able to take them gate to wire. And as you said, his odds plummeted to about really almost a third of what they were, with about 2 minutes to post. It's something you don't like to see. Obviously, we know in this sport, in the win pools in most of these jurisdictions, most of the win money does come in the final minutes to seconds of wagering. So you can see gigantic swings like that. And with a lot of the CIW money coming in late, you do see that happen. Maybe more tracks will do what New York has done, where they have gotten a lot of that CIW money out of the win pool, so you don't see any more of those late shifts in the win pool. And while you will see them in exactas and doubles, and I know some people have been talking about how a lot of that money has shifted to different pools, it does just improve the optics, that you don't see a horse going from 20-1 to 8-1 during a race when you have the odds displayed on the screen. So maybe more tracks want to go in that direction in the future. And playing New York, it actually has made the win pool a safer pool to get involved in, because you're not surprised during the race anymore. Even if the double says that a horse is going to drop late, you don't see it happen in the win pool because you don't have that money coming in late. So maybe more tracks want to go in that direction. But getting back to the Woodbine Mile and Town Cruise, the local horse got it done. And I've got to say, I like the way that his rider, Daisuke Fukumoto, rode him, because when you're on a speed horse like this that figures to be alone in front, you want to build up that advantage and don't let the closers into the race. And he opened up 2 lengths, didn't relinquish the lead the entire way. Horses like Raging Bull and Set Piece were just left with too much to do. And frankly, Set Piece and Raging Bull, they're just proving to be not the most reliable horses in this division anyway, and they really didn't show up with their top efforts here.
No, just one quick thing. I totally agree with you about Naira. They have had some issues lately, and we'll talk about one of them soon, but the thing with the cutting off the wind pull early is a very good thing in my opinion, and I hope others adopt that strategy. As for the race itself, I totally agree with you about Town Cruise. What I really like is when you look at the pace figures, yeah, he was alone on the lead, but he wasn't setting slow fractions, particularly for this distance on that course. None of the fractions are coded in blue in TimeformUS. There were plenty of turf races on the day, so it was a solid pace. I know people like to look at the fractions during a race and think they can judge if it's fast or slow, but that's pretty hard to do. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And in this case, I think that 24 opening quarter was a little deceiving, particularly when you saw the 47 half. He was running up on the front end, so he earned it. And I don't think the ones in behind have as much excuse as some people want to think they do, because, like I said, it's not like he set a dawdling pace up there and just absolutely flew home with no chance of being caught. They didn't close particularly fast in this race, particularly for that Woodbine course, but nobody else could make up any ground, and he was actually pulling away a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't know what to make of some of those that finished in behind. I guess my takeaway coming out of this race is that the Euros that come over for the Breeders' Cup Mile are probably going to be pretty tough, because I didn't see anything in this race that's going to scare away any shippers. I mean, the winner, Town Cruise, if you didn't read the articles, he's not nominated to the Breeders' Cup, and the connections have already said they're not going to that race. That's not on the schedule for him. So we'll see. Horses like Raging Bull and Set Piece, they've run some big speed figures, but they've generally done it not in the Grade 1 races. I know Raging Bull has that victory in the Maker's Mile earlier in the year, but he just never has run back to that race since then. And it feels like any of the Euros that come over for the Breeders' Cup Mile are probably going to be formidable.
Yeah, I would agree. And you say they've run nice speed figures, and they have, but they're not Breeders' Cup speed figures, even when they're winning. And as we're going to talk about it with these other races coming up, which the Euros thoroughly dominated for the most part, it's hard to envision they don't have some milers that can beat this group.
No, and I'm looking at the schedule here. The next 4 races that we have to talk about are won by the same connections, Godolphin and Charlie Appleby. And let's kick it off with the Canadian International, the other Grade 1 that was run on Saturday at Woodbine. And Walton Street, a horse who had not really been a Group 1 horse in Europe or Dubai. I think he had failed a couple times at that level. But one that definitely has been coming into his own for a long time. He's a horse that's reaching his peak very late in his career. But he had obviously taken a big step forward just over the past calendar year. And they brought over a horse that just seems to be thriving right now, and he's also a European horse that has plenty of tactical speed, so he just got the jump on everybody and was just superior to this field in the end.
Yeah, he was much the best. The bettors aren't surprised anymore. I mean, obviously they're paying attention. He went off 4-5, got a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, so a good Grade 1 number, and it was quite a bit back to the runner-up, so not a whole lot to talk about. I would imagine they would probably want to try this horse in a race like the Breeders' Cup Turf, because why not? I mean, he proved what he could do to this field. He's not as good overseas, as you said. He's been running well, but not at this class level, and not, against the kind of horses he would face over there if he was to go back for some of the bigger races. So maybe he's pointed to the Breeders' Cup. It's impossible to say until we see who shows up where he'd fit, but I've mentioned it many times. I'm really growing to love these turf routers, especially at this 1.5-mile distance, because we see it here with a 7-year-old who's still around and probably running the best race of his life.
And I know some people have mixed feelings about these Europeans coming over and winning races in this country. And, they like to see the American barns and the American riders and owners get the victories in these races. But frankly, these races would be a little bit sad if they didn't have the European participation these days, because the Americans just, in many cases, aren't equipped to go these distances, aren't equipped to run the kind of numbers the Europeans do when they come over. So I love it. I mean, we'll talk about some of the races in New York a little bit later, but I like the European representation in these races. It doesn't bother me that they come over and win and snatch up the purses, because the more we get to see these horses in this country, it gives us a better read come Breeders' Cup time on how they're going to fare against the American horses that are pointing for those races. And as for Walton Street, I don't have a whole lot more to say about this race. He was a dominant winner. As for the Breeders' Cup prospects for this guy, clearly Godolphin and Charlie Appleby have many options for the Breeders' Cup races that they could be participating in. And he's proven his class overseas. Going back to that Dubai Shima Classic from late March, he finished just a few lengths behind Mishriff and the Japanese duo of Chronogenesis and Love's Only You. I believe Love's Only You from Japan is planning to come for the Breeders' Cup turf. So that could be a pretty interesting race with a lot of foreign participation. So Walton Street would definitely be in that conversation, but many horses from overseas would be.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note the runner-up actually was a horse who had won this race, I believe, 2 years in a row. Desert Encounter being another foreign shipper for different connections, obviously, but he was going for a three-peat. Didn't run as well as he had in the past, but I think he was just beaten by a better horse.
Now, on Sunday at Woodbine, they ran a couple more Grade 1s on the turf for the 2-year-olds. Let's begin with the filly version of the race, the Natalma, both of these going the 1-turn mile at Woodbine. And Charlie Appleby and Godolphin, again, swept both of these races. And I should say Frankie Dettori also was the rider in all of these situations at Woodbine. The winner of the Natalma, Wild Beauty, she had some adversity to overcome in this race, because she was absolutely clobbered at the start, really off to just a tangled beginning, getting slammed out of the gate. So she found herself at the back of the pack, but she made a menacing advance midway through the race. And once they got in the stretch, she just shut the door on all these rivals and was a very impressive winner.
Yeah, she was much the best. And the speed figure points that out, despite the trouble that you mentioned, which probably had to have cost her a few lengths at least. She got a 108 TimeformUS speed figure. Very good, particularly on turf for 2-year-olds this time of year. Just a dominant winner. I haven't heard what the plans are for her. Hopefully she would be a Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf participant, because it's hard not to like everything you saw from this one.
Yeah, she just built up so much momentum coming off the far turn and carried it through in the stretch. The runner-up, Pizza Bianca, she had been an impressive winner at Saratoga in her debut for Bobby Flay and Christophe Clement. And, I mean, she did have minor traffic trouble in upper stretch when Wild Beauty was sort of slingshotting to the lead. Pizza Bianca was kind of trying to muscle her way through traffic. I don't think it mattered in the end, though. I would say that Wild Beauty's trouble early was greater than anything that Pizza Bianca encountered, and she was just simply second best to the winner here. And like you said, a very fast race, especially for 2-year-olds at this time of year. So you'd have to imagine at this point, before we've seen any of the other preps, Wild Beauty, if she goes to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf, would be the favorite right now. We'll see what happens and what transpires in the preps that are going to be run at Belmont and at Keeneland in subsequent weeks. As for the male version of this race, the Summer, again, same connections winning this one with the European shipper Albar, and a very similar kind of trip, though he broke slowly and it was his own doing. He didn't get bumped at the start or anything. He just kind of broke 2 lengths behind the field of his own accord, but he still made an impressive run into the race, just the final time a little bit slower than the filly.
Yeah, some of that was probably due to the pace. They went quite a bit slower in this race than they did in the filly race, but not enough that I was going to do anything crazy with the speed figures. I ran 6,900 slower than the fillies did, so he got only a 101. Like you said, he did have similar trouble he had trouble at the start, but it was all his own doing, so he could run faster if you think he would overcome that problem next out. Who knows? I'd probably have to go back and watch some of his older races from overseas and see if the gate's a normal problem for him, read the comments. I didn't actually do that before this race because he looked pretty dominant coming in, was 3-5, so I didn't have a lot of betting interest in it. But he delivered, so we'll see where he shows up next.
Yeah, he seems like another exciting prospect. He's actually a winner of 4 races in a row. He had won his 3 prior races in England coming into this one, and had done so on the front end a couple of times. So interesting that he was able to overcome that trouble, and or I should say, overcome that poor start that he created for himself, and still pass the entire field to get up here. Though I will say. The field that was assembled for, among those that were campaigned in Canada and the U.S. prior to this for the summer stakes, not the strongest, and I think that's why Albar was bet down to 3-5 in this spot coming in from Europe. You didn't even really have a horse like Pizza Bianca, who had been so impressive at Saratoga, finishing second in the Talma. So, we've got to see if this one will get the class test next time in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf if they decide to go that route. But one that maybe has something to prove even after winning this race, but definitely a visually impressive winner. Let's move on to Belmont Park, where they ran some turf stakes this past weekend. The two that we're going to talk about from Saturday are the Jockey Club Derby and Oaks, both going those marathon distances on the turf for the 3-year-olds. Let's begin with the version for the males, the Jockey Club Derby going 1.5 miles on the Widener turf course. And again, same connections, Appleby and Godolphin sending over Yabir, a son of Dubawi, who had really been coming into his own in the second half of his 3-year-old season. And especially since they decided to change up his running style and come from off the pace with him, because he is a horse, if you watch his early races in Europe, had been a front runner, and they decided in about his last 3 or 4 races to try to take him off the pace, place him at the back of the pack and make one run. And that has really taken him to the next level from a form standpoint. And that's how they rode him here. And he made quite the impressive move at the top of the stretch to take the lead.
He did. You could see on the turn he was going to run by the field. It sure seemed like. I mean, we've seen those moves flatten out before, but he just looked like he was running a different race than everybody else. He was moving so much faster, and he went from 7th to 1st, and it seemed like almost the blink of an eye, and just cruised home from there. We do have the race in red fractions. The course was pretty quick, so it's a little tricky with these longer races. You've brought it up before where the raw times seem to not look that fast, and they probably are, and it's just how these races are run. So I take those red fractions in these races with a little bit of grain of salt. He did wind up with a 118 TimeformUS speed figure, which is pretty good for a 3-year-old. Not sure what the plans are with him, but he would still have quite a ways to go despite that visual impression to be able to compete with the older horses, I would say, even the ones based here in the States.
Yeah, I think the major question coming out of this Jockey Club Derby was what really was behind him in this race. The runner-up Soldier Rising has now been second in both the Saratoga Derby and this Jockey Club Derby. I'm not really sure where he stacks up against some of the top horses in Europe. He had not had very strong European form when he came over to this country originally. And the other Euro in this race, Bolshoi Ballet, he's just never really panned out. I know that he won the Belmont Derby against a slightly weaker field, but he hasn't done a whole lot of running since then. In a fast pace in the Saratoga Derby, didn't have much of an excuse here. He was disappointing. Yabir, though, just seems like a horse that keeps getting better. And Jamie Spencer, who rode him, you could see at the start of the race, he was trying to get Yabir a little bit closer because he was very slow into stride, and he just looks like kind of a lazy horse that you have to niggle at for really the entire race. But as you said, Craig, once Jamie Spencer really set him down on the far turn, he was just moving at a different rate than everybody else, and he quickly swallowed up the field and was an impressive winner of this race. We'll see how he stacks up against the horses that come for the Breeders' Cup if they decide to go that route. I think right now for these connections, they're winner of the Canadian International. Walton Street would have to be considered a stronger contender than Yabir, but he definitely is one that still has upside. As for the Jockey Club Oaks for the fillies, which was run one race earlier on a different course, the inner turf course going 1 3/8 miles, Chad Brown just dominated this race with the first 2 finishers, Shantasara and Higher Truth, and he was really able to do that because of the pace of this race, and his 2 fillies were the ones that had forward position, and it turned into a sprint to the wire, and none of the closers could get involved at all.
No, it was. It's another one of those tricky races. Of course, they don't run this distance very often. We don't have any of the fractions, I think, except for the mile fraction coded in blue. And it seems like the pace was actually slowing throughout the race until they got into near the top of the stretch. And watching this race, I mean, those looked like Losal quarter horses coming down the stretch. I mean, those they look to be absolutely flying home. So, as you said, it gave nobody else much of a chance. Shantisara was able to get a really nice 122 time form US speed figure, which is for 3 year olds. That's above par, I would say. This race isn't graded, but I think with a purse like that, we can safely assume it was close to a grade one, if not one, and I'm sure it'll be graded as soon as it's eligible. But just a really nice effort from her. I would give some excuses, as you said, in behind the horse that shipped over for Andre Fabre, Harajuka. Certainly ran very well. She was the one that kind of caught the eye, making up ground, whereas nobody else was able to. She was at least getting to him and was only a length behind at the finish.
Yeah, this is a situation where I know for the TimeformUS speed figures, we give a bonus to horses that come home very fast in their races. And Shantisara did get a 122 TimeformUS speed figure here, which is 4 points higher than the 118 that Yabir got. For what it's worth, the final time number of the Jockey Club Derby was higher than the Jockey Club Oaks. We're just giving Shantisara a big pace bonus for coming home so quickly. I have a little bit of a problem with that in this situation because the two horses that came home the fastest were the two early leaders, so they had all the best of it up front, Higher Truth and Shantisara. So this is one where I'd go a little bit more based on the final time number for Shantisara, a 117, rather than the 122. I don't think that she deserves much extra credit, except for the fact that she was too wide the entire way, whereas the other top three finishers, the first, third, and fourth finishers, all rode the rail for their entire trips. And if you were watching the first week at Belmont, they had the rail set at 0 feet on both courses, but on the inner turf course especially, horses that rode the rail had significant advantages in the races on the inner. Race after race, horses that had rail position were just running away in the stretch from horses that were wide on the turns. And to Shantisara's credit, even though she was only too wide and was pretty close to the rail throughout, we didn't see too many horses even getting too wide trips finishing off the races. So Shantisara does deserve some credit for that. Higher Truth, she's been beaten by narrow margins in the Belmont Oaks, the Saratoga Oaks, the Jockey Club Oaks. I think she's been beaten less than a length in all of those races, but she has gotten absolutely perfect trips every time. That was the case here. She had no excuse to lose this race. She sprinted for home too, but Shantisara was just sprinting faster. And Craig, what you said is true. If you look at Trackus, it's not just the visual impression. Trackus had Shantisara coming home the final quarter mile in 21.67 seconds, which is as fast as you're going to see a horse come home in any race, but especially going a mile and 3/8. And I think that just speaks to how slow they were going on the front end.
Yeah, that and how firm it probably was down towards the inside. One subject before we move on from, but well, we still have one more race, but since it was mostly turf races, I do want to say I did time the vast majority of these races from video at Belmont because they just had a catastrophe on opening week with timing of races. It was brutal. Everybody could see it when the times came up. At first, I thought it was limited to the inner turf, but it wasn't. It was inner turf. It was outer turf. There were dirt races. It started on opening day. It went all the way through Sunday. So let's just hope somebody at NYRA takes this seriously and is embarrassed enough into being able to get the races time more accurately next week.
Yeah, it was a big problem. It's a good transition into the final race we're going to talk about from Belmont, the Christie Cat, which is yet another race where the fractions that were posted do not correspond to what actually, how fast the horses actually went. Baystorm won this race, and the fractions that were posted were almost 24 to the opening quarter, which if you know 6 furlong races at Belmont on the turf, that you rarely see that happen. You also rarely see second quarters that are faster than the first quarter. And that's what the posted fraction said. So, Craig, I know you video timed this race. I'll let you talk about what the actual fractions were. But this is something that we saw in a lot of the turf races, a lot of the races in general at Belmont during opening week. And I echo everything you said. They've got to get this sorted out because it's it's not a good look for the premier racing circuit in the country to be putting out totally unreliable data. The track announcer, Chris Griffin, I thought did a fantastic job on Friday through Sunday after Frank Miramati filled in for John Imbriale on Thursday. He always does a great job. Frank does. And I thought Chris Griffin also did an admirable job announcing the races. But you could see even he knew at a certain point, just don't announce the fractions or announce them with skepticism in your voice, because everything was coming up wrong, and they've got to get this sorted out. It shouldn't be that hard to time the races, especially on the turf when the rails are set at 0 feet. That should be when the times are most accurate, and nothing was right this week. They really have to get this sorted out.
Yeah, it was very frustrating for me. I could pull up the times. I think that was the eighth race. The actual fractions for that race should have been like 22:19 and 44:88. It's a case where it's a very long run up. So, I mean, as soon as you saw 23:67, the run up's listed at 180 feet. And just to show how messed up this industry can be, I went and found some older races. I think the Jaipur was run over the same course back on Belmont Day. And the gate was in the same exact place. And sometimes the run-up's listed as 150, sometimes 180. So, I mean, we just have to do better as an industry. We got to give people accurate data and then let them do with it what you want. Run-up's bad enough in and of itself. But at least if I know the run-up's accurate, I can time the races from video, know the real distance, and use that. There are people out there doing pretty deep analytics, not that this would be, but for horse racing it would, where you could time the races yourself, know the distance, and have better figures than everybody else out there. But in addition to the times, we're not getting accurate run-ups, so you don't know what to make of these when you don't know what the distance and what the time is of these races. So just do better horse racing. And don't get me wrong, it's not just NYRA. There are plenty of tracks out there that have timing problems. But as you say, they're the leader in the industry. They're the best circuit going right now, the full year round. So they kind of set the example. And if NYRA is not going to do better, what's going to make smaller tracks care?
And just to wrap up this race that we were talking about from Friday, the Christie Cat, it was one of 2 6-furlong stakes races run on that Friday card. The filly version actually did go faster. This one won by Bay Storm from the Jonathan Thomas barn. And she was the one that was setting those honest fractions that Craig did time from video, the 22 and 44 and change. But she finished up in good time and got a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure, which is solid for a 3-year-old filly. This, though, was another situation where this race was run over the inner turf course. And even though she was setting an honest pace, she had all the best of it, saving ground the entire way. The only other horse that did any running in this race was the runner-up Caldi, who sat right behind her on the rail. Everybody else was not on the rail in this race, and they were just spinning their wheels through the stretch. So I'm going to do a Horses to Watch segment, which you can find on DRF's YouTube channel later today. I think we'll post it, or maybe tomorrow. And I'm going to highlight some horses that were wide on the inner turf course, because these are the kind of trips that you do want to bet back in the future. Horses that were compromised against biases. And I know some people will pay attention to this a lot on the dirt and kind of dismiss it on the turf, but we definitely saw a bias on the inner turf this past week at Belmont.
Yeah, and it kind of shows. I'm not sure if I mentioned Bay Storm's speed figures. He ran a 1:15, which was 5 points faster than the Colts did. Can't really compare them. They were run on 2 different courses. Of course, that one was also mistimed. But as I said, we time them from video. But that was a 14-point jump. Now, granted, she hadn't run. She ran back in August, so not super long ago. But I think a good portion of that 14-point improvement probably had more to do with the course than it did with the horse.
Let's now move on to Churchill Downs, where we're going to spend the bulk of our show with plenty of stakes action to dissect. And Craig, let's start by giving ourselves a little bit of a pat on the back, because we gave out some pretty good ideas on the forecast last week. And I think if you played the ticket that I was kind of mentioning with the ABC method, and if you had incorporated Craig's opinions a little more strongly, you definitely would have hit this pick 5, which did pay $741.50. A really generous payout, I thought, considering the winners of this race, which I thought were all pretty logical. We did a decent job dissecting this one. And let's begin by talking about the Locust Grove, the penultimate race in that sequence in the final stakes race they ran on Saturday night. She Dares the Devil. I can't say that I love when they try to back down the pace so much in these dirt races because it just doesn't give these horses that much margin for error. And it got pretty close at the end, but the connections, Florent Drew and Brad Cox, they were able to pull this one out.
Yeah, there were a plethora of blue fractions at Churchill Downs on Saturday, and I do think for the most part they affected the speed figures. I'm actually consider. I'm not saying I will change anything, but just go back and make sure because there were so many, maybe I overlooked some races that could have got that P notation and their speed figure boosted a little bit, and this would certainly fall into that category. As She Dares the Devil only got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure. The final time was a 114. But honestly, as you say, I think a lot of that was the pace. She was on a clear lead and ran just a 94 opening quarter mile, which is, claiming horse time, really. So I'm not sure what to make of this from a speed figure perspective. The top three basically ran 1, 2, 3 all the way around the track. Even the horse who finished fourth was fourth early and dropped back and then came on later. So just kind of a merry-go-round race. Nobody seemed too interested in engaging the 3 to 5 favorite. As you know from the forecast, I was kind of hoping for Crystal Ball, but she got bet down so heavily. I lost some enthusiasm on that end as well. I would have helped to pick 5 a little bit, but just an okay effort for me. I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in this when I'm handicapping races going forward.
No, this reminded me a lot of the La Trienne that She Dares the Devil won earlier in the year, which got a similarly low speed figure, and she came back and did run faster in subsequent starts, but even though she ran faster, she was still no match for Latruska or even her stablemate Bonnie South next time in the Ogden Phipps, and She Dares the Devil, a nice horse. I know that she has that one win over Latruska from earlier in the year, but performances like this, I don't think they're going to scare away anybody moving on to the Breeders' Cup Distaff, and it just feels like there are some others out there, particularly Latruska, but maybe even more than that are maybe just a slight cut above She Dares the Devil at this point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just don't see any way she's in the same league as a horse like Latruska.
Let's talk about both of those 2-year-old stakes races that they ran on Saturday night at Churchill Downs, both going the mile and the 16th distance on the dirt. And certainly the more impressive of the two was the winner of the Pocahontas, the 2-year-old filly Hidden Connection, who is now 2 for 2 in her career, stretching out off a 5.5 furlong victory in her debut. All the way out to a mile and a 16th is not an easy task, and she handled it with the utmost professionalism. Not the fastest speed figure in the world, but you have to love the way she did it from a visual standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't much of a race, to be honest, from start to finish. She never looked like a loser, even though she was sitting off one of the longer prices in the field, or at least a mid-priced horse in Lemieux. Looked like she was always going to take over. You were dead right about the morning line. I think this horse was 9-2 on the morning line, went off 9-5, but it would be hard to argue 9-5 wasn't a gift when you saw how she won this race. Got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. It was a race again that has some blue fractions. The early pace was pretty slow, so maybe that helped her out, and maybe the runner-up ran a little bit better than looked, but certainly not where I would say she was anywhere near as good as the winner.
No, and there just wasn't a whole lot behind her at the end of the day in this race, but I mean, she clearly is in a different league than these horses. And I have to like the way that she finished up, even though the pace was slow. You always have a question about whether these horses that are stretching out from sprints can finish up with that same power that they show in the sprint races, and she really did, the way that she widened from this field at the end. Nice to see Rayla Gutierrez, who doesn't get that many opportunities in graded stakes races, get the victory here at Churchill Downs in a graded stakes, and I would imagine they allow him to keep them out, moving on to some bigger races later in the year. And she has to be considered a player right now, moving forward to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. We'll see what else is out there. We've seen some impressive 2-year-olds, but she's the first one that has done so going 2 turns. So all of the others have the stamina question to answer at this point, but she definitely is in the conversation, at least right now. Moving on to the Iroquois, which was the other division of this race run for the males, going the same distance. And not the most impressive race from a visual standpoint or against the clock, as Major General gets the job done in a desperate finish, but it didn't seem like any of these horses were relishing the 2 turns or would have beaten Hidden Connection had they been in the Pocahontas.
No, I mean, this race was more than a full second slower than the fillies ran, and the pace was actually quicker. So it's not a case where you could say, well, the pace contributed to, they went so slow, they couldn't run a good final time. It just wasn't a very good race. I'm not sure what happened. I'll be honest, this is a race I haven't watched yet, where Guntown just didn't show up at all. Not Guntown.
Stellar Tap.
Stellar Tap. Yeah, Stellar Tap. Just didn't really show up. He showed up. I mean, he was up on the lead, but he just didn't have anything. He didn't look that good in the chart at all compared to how he looked coming in. It looked like he was going to be really strong in here. So I'm not sure what happened to him. Major General does look like he had a bit of a trip. Maybe that explains his regression from a 104 speed figure first time out winning to a 95. I would guess it was more that than the distance change. It looks like he was wide, had a little bit of a tough start, but overall it's kind of hard to get excited for me when the Colts run this much slower than the fillies.
Yeah, I didn't see a whole lot in this race that made me want to take any of these horses moving forward. There were about 5 horses stacked across the track trying to show speed into the clubhouse turn, and Major General was the one that couldn't quite go with that first flight, so he had to back out a little bit and was forced to rate. I don't think the intention was to rate. And then he did make a 4-wide sweep around the far turn, so he was wide around both turns. Still, though, he took it over like he was going to go on and win by a couple lengths, and it became pretty close at the end, and the couple of horses that were chasing him home, Tough to Tame and Red Knobs, their form coming into this race was pretty lackluster, much slower speed figures, so I don't know if it's really a positive that they got as close to Major General as they did. As for Stellar Tap, who was unsurprisingly bet down to be the even money favorite in this race, I don't know what happened. The one thing I will say about Stellar Tap is that the bottom side of his pedigree is all turf. Just every horse is a turf horse, good stakes horses on the turf. So I wonder if, even though he won his debut sprinting on the dirt, if ultimately he's going to be one that wants a surface switch down the line. But he was a big disappointment in here. I did not see a big excuse for him. So I feel like there are going to be stronger preps for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile in the coming weeks.
Yeah, the one thing, I don't know how you'd think about this, but when I saw the result, it kind of reminded me of Tiz the Law, who just threw in kind of his one clunker at Churchill. I don't think it was the same race. I think it was a little later on. But yeah, this wasn't good. But if you're hoping that he's going to rebound, you just have to put a line through this one.
A couple of sprint stakes were run earlier on this card at Churchill Downs, one of which we discussed on the forecast last week. And Craig, I have to imagine that you were pretty pleased to get 3-1 on Just Might, who won the Louisville Thoroughbred Society over the closing endorsed.
Yeah, that was surprising, to say the least, to me. I didn't get that at all. I would imagine both of our guest hosts, sometimes Marcus Hirsch, was similarly delighted. He's another one that's been on this horse's bandwagon, is keeping him on turf, or on dirt, I mean. And it's not so much that he can't run on turf. It just seems like he's finding a lot easier spots on the dirt, which kind of goes against the conventional thinking. But this was a race with no pace on paper. He set a super slow pace. Personally, I wish he'd run a little bit, something we talked about earlier, instead of keeping everybody around early, which he did. And Endorsed was actually making up some pretty good ground on him late, but he was still able to hang on. He's game. He got the job done again, and we'll see. I imagine they're going to try to keep him on dirt. I know we had been told when we asked why this horse was on turf all the time, they said he had an injury and the dirt was tough on him. But here they've run him back twice on dirt in less than a month, so maybe he's over whatever ailed him. But I would still like to see him running faster. Part of it, I do think, was because of the slow paces he's been in both of his last 2 races. He showed he can run a pretty fast race back at the fairgrounds. I think it was back during the winter time. But these speed figures leave a little bit to be desired. So it's not always as easy as saying you can run back to a race that happened 8 months ago.
Yeah, he's now won 4 races in a row on the dirt. He's had plenty of losses on the turf interspersed between those races. So we'll see what they decide to do with him moving forward. I don't think he's the kind of horse that is going to be competitive in a race like the Breeders' Cup Sprint. He's just not running fast enough to really be in that conversation, especially given some of the players that have emerged in that division, especially over the past month or so. But he did get the job done here, setting, as you said, what was a pretty slow pace, one of many slow paces this Saturday night at Churchill Downs. The big disappointment in this race, I think, was Bango, who applied some token early pressure to Just Might, but just couldn't go with him late, and he really regressed here as the even money favorite.
Yeah, there's not a lot to say about him. I mean, he's a horse. Maybe you could try to blame the pace, but Endorse was further back than him, and he was able to outfinish him pretty easily, outfinish Bango. He's also a horse who's won right up on the lead, so he just didn't have it. He was a little bit of a phony favorite, I would say, in here. I do want to address what, like you said, we had all these in blue fractions, a really slow pace figure of only 92. And I'm sure most of our listeners realize it, but some might look at that opening 21.81 quarter and think, well, how could that be slow? But at Churchill, they just have a really, really long run up. I want to say it's almost a quarter of a furlong. So they're really fully rolling by the time they get going. So that 21.81 is quite a bit deceiving.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about a couple more 6 furlong races from Churchill that had faster opening quarters and still had relatively slow paces. Actually, in the very next race, the Open Mind, a race we didn't talk about from earlier in the night at Churchill Downs on Saturday, at least on the forecast last week. But the two main players in this race, Sconson and Bells the One, have faced off many times before. They threw it down again here. Sconson has a little bit more tactical speed than Bells the One, so she got the jump on her. But when you've got two closers in a sprint, they both are kind of at the mercy of how quickly the leaders go with respect to how fast of a speed figure they're able to run.
Yeah, similar race. They both came in having run like 115 and 116 speed figures last time out. They only got 108 and 109 here, and it's strictly a function of the pace, as you see. Again, they went 21.64 early, and you might think that's fast just looking at the raw number, but it's not all that unusual for us to get sub 21 opening quarters at Churchill, particularly when you're talking about quality horses. So I wouldn't put too much into this race from a figure standpoint. The two best horses were able to win. No excuses for Monday Call whatsoever. A horse who was able to make an actual clear early lead and just had nothing for the top two. So they were clearly best in here. I think they're both better than their figures would indicate, but how good is another story. They both seem at their best to just consistently run right around that 115 number, which isn't going to win a lot of top class races.
Wrap up Churchill Downs by talking about a couple of races from their Friday card, beginning with an allowance optional claiming race run as the 9th on Friday at Churchill Downs, and going 1.25 miles, an unusual distance for an allowance race, but Colonel's Dark Temper, the winner here, he loved every bit of the distance as he opened up on the field like he was Bodemeister in the Kentucky Derby, except unlike that one, he never looked back, and I loved the enterprising ride from Brian Hernandez, and this is how you ride a speed horse and basically take everybody else out of the race and off the bridle, and nobody could close.
Yeah, this was an impressive performance for him. I know he is a 7-year-old now, so it probably seems like a very long time ago. But this horse actually won the West Virginia Derby as a 3-year-old. He ran some other pretty good races. I think he was runner-up in the Indiana Derby and the Matt Winn that year. But I distinctly remember that West Virginia Derby where he got a nice 120s kind of speed figure. But he's a guy that's just been a warrior. He's getting close to that $1 million mark. This was his 38th start. Only the 8th time he's won, but he's now won 3 of his last 4. The one loss was in that West Virginia Governor's Cup last time out. Who knows what happened that day? Over a track, as I mentioned, he had run good on before, but he didn't seem to handle it at all. But he looks like he's found some of his youth, particularly at Churchill. As that's 3 in a row. All easy open length wins for him. So maybe they get ambitious and start pointing to a race like the one in November, not the Foss, the Clark. I assume that one's still on the calendar. And I don't see why he couldn't fit in there. It just depends who shows up. It usually doesn't get too many horses that ran in the Breeders' Cup anymore, so it would kind of be a second tier race, real not second tier. I mean, it's still graded pretty highly, but it's not going to be your typical late summer grade one.
And we generally don't see particularly fast paces in a lot of those dirt route stakes for the older horses. I know that Colonel's Dark Temper was unable to make the early lead in that West Virginia Governor's Cup that you just mentioned, and maybe that's why he didn't run so well. But using the kind of tactics they did to win this optional claiming allowance race, he could be dangerous in stakes company if he's able to get to the front end. I will say that if you look at the TimeformUS charts for this race, the whole day was color-coded red, indicating that speed had an advantage. And I would assume that's a little bit more reliable on these Churchill Downs cards where they don't have any turf racing carded. It's just 10 dirt races. So you do have a larger sample size to make that determination. So perhaps he was a little bit helped by the track profile. And that's a good segue into the final race we're going to talk about from Churchill Downs. The last race on Friday, which was won by first-time starter Ugiri, a 2-year-old filly that turned a lot of heads with her 7-length victory here. Again, not sure what was behind her in this race, but she certainly did it the right way on debut.
Yeah, she did, and she didn't get bet all that hard. She was 9-1 at the windows. A couple horses who had previously run took most of the money in here, but she ran a very good race. Obviously, drew away to win by 7. She got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. You do have to wonder about that red, as you say. It's a notation that says the speed horses did a lot better than they normally do, and that's considering that speed usually does pretty well on dirt. We do ignore races that are won by like really heavy favorites, but there is plenty big sample size. We had 10 races all on dirt, so it's definitely worth perusing the charts and seeing if you agree with that red coded assessment.
Yeah, and I probably was a little bit remiss to not point out that there was some form behind her, as the third place finisher Ocean Size was actually the horse that was second to Hidden Connection when she made her debut at Colonial. So that form actually does hold up pretty well because that horse came back and basically repeated her TimeformUS speed figure, actually improving a couple points, finishing behind Ugiri. So that kind of validates the form of this race and the speed figure she got of 101. So I think this horse could be okay, and it just remains to be seen what kind of horse she turns out to be, if she's a pure sprinter or if they're able to stretch out with her. Let's finish things up with one more race for the 2-year-olds from a venue that we don't visit that often, at least not on this show. I know Craig's been there quite a few times. That's Remington Park, going all the way back to last Wednesday. And Craig, I saw you tweeted about this race, and I looked it up when I was doing the rundown for the Pacecast this week. This was a 2-year-old maiden race that was the final race of the day on their Wednesday card at Remington. It was won by a horse, El Pondo, who just destroyed a field going 5 furlongs for a trainer that I know that I've never heard of before.
Yeah, I believe it was her first career start. I knew nothing about her. She's also listed as the owner. I've had since I tweeted about it, a few people told me about it on Twitter. Apparently, they tried to sell her at a sale. I think maybe it was in Texas, going from memory, and didn't get the reserve met, so she took her back and ran her, and I would imagine this horse will be sold pretty quickly, given they tried to sell him once already. This was a big effort. It was just one of those, kind of last race at Remington. I have RTN on in the background, and as I'm watching, I was like, wait, what am I seeing right now? This is not your typical 2-year-old Remington Park maiden special weight race. I mean, we do get some runners here every now and then, but we don't get a lot of 107 TimeformUS speed figures, particularly if they aren't trained by somebody like Steve Asmussen, who sends quite a few here. So really big effort. I don't know what to make of it. It was just at 5 furlongs, but I mean, nobody was beating this horse this day if they went 6 or 6.5, as he was just pulling away from the field. So it'll be interesting to see what barn he winds up in. Like I said, I'd be shocked if he isn't sold between now and his next start. I don't know if you did any look at the breeding. He's obviously by Spatestown on the a Spatestown mare, but yeah, visually, this was a big effort, and it certainly matched the speed figure.
No, this actually reminds me a lot of when we talked about Witzel's debut from Tampa last year, and we kind of both said this horse is probably going to wind up in a different barn next time, and lo and behold, he showed up for Chad Brown months later and ran Bo Liam to a nose decision at Saratoga. So we'll see what ultimately happens with El Pondo, but I agree, watching this race visually, it looked like an ordinary race until the quarter pole, when David Cabrera really set this horse down, and he just kicked it into a different gear, and especially in the final eighth of a mile. I mean, he was just galloping away from these horses with ease and geared down at the end. And it seemed like he couldn't even pull him up coming across the wire. Just a really impressive effort from this horse. Again, only 5 furlongs, but as you pointed out, a 107 TimeformUS speed figure, really nice for a 2-year-old. That's actually 6 points higher than the number Ugiri earned, the horse that got so many people talking on social media after her victory on Friday at Churchill Downs. So definitely a colt worth following, like you said, one that would seem likely to be sold eventually, and we'll see where he ultimately ends up, but definitely a horse that seems like an exciting prospect. I did look up the pedigree. Outwork, we don't know a whole lot about him as a sire just yet. There is some sprint pedigree on the dam side, so I think a horse that we still need to learn quite a bit about.
Yeah, and you mentioned Remington Park. I will use that as a little bit of a segue. I'll be there on Sunday and probably a couple days this weekend because it's Oklahoma Derby weekend. And the reason I mention it is because I wanted to mention that you and I are going to be doing something new for DRF. We're going to do some individual race recaps, and one of them, or not recaps, but previews. And one of them is going to be the Remington Oaks, which I believe is on the Oklahoma Derby card. If not, it's the day before. But just something we're going to talk about. I think we're doing 4 races this week. Kind of won't be the same as what we get from Dan Illman and Mike Beer, but along that same thing where we preview some of the biggest stakes races coming up during the week.
No, I know we're both excited about that. The DRF video team wants a little bit more handicapping talent to share those stakes previews with, so we're both excited about that. We'll be putting out a few of those videos from various different tracks this week and in the coming weeks, so you could see Craig and I actually on camera. You could see our faces as we talk about these races and put out some handicapping opinions for some stakes around the country over the next few weeks. One of them, as Craig said, will be the Remington Park Oaks, so look for those coming out on DRF's YouTube channel on Thursday and Friday, and we will also be doing the TimeformUS forecast later in the week. Craig, I know we haven't talked about it yet. I would imagine that we probably might want to focus on the Pennsylvania Derby card at Parks on Saturday. They've got a slew of stakes races. Those races, I think, have come up stronger than people even expected. I saw Jackie's Warrior was entered for the Gallant Bob. They might be rerouting from the Vosburg to that race. The Pennsylvania Derby just looks absolutely loaded with talent and top 3-year-olds. So maybe we can talk about a sequence at Parks on the TimeformUS forecast, which we'll record coming up this upcoming Friday.
Yeah, I was assuming that's the direction we're going to go. It certainly looks like the best way. I'm not sure which races have the pick 5s or anything like that. We'll figure that out in the interim. But yeah, that's going to be a fun card, and I can be up front. If Jackie's Warrior's in it, I'm singling. I'm not going any further in that race.
I don't think that'll be going out on too much of a limb looking at the field that he's running against, but we'll see if our opinions line up when we handicap that later in the week. Everybody, thanks for listening today. Remember, you can always catch these DRF podcasts and all of DRF's video offerings, drf.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and their YouTube channel where all the videos are posted. And remember to subscribe to all those channels if you want to follow DRF's content that we put out. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to tune in to those videos and the TimeformUS forecast later in the week.